We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amar Aleph in Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 87a. The Mishnah continues, Bas Kohen shenisas liYisrael. Let's say you have a Bas Kohen, she marries a Yisrael. So the halach is, Lo tochal b'truma, she's not allowed to eat truma, because now that she's married to Yisrael, she loses out on the truma. Mace, let's say he dies, V'lo menu ben, and she has a son from him. Again, Lo tochal b'truma, since she has a son from this Yisrael, this non-Kohen, she cannot eat truma. Nisas leLevi, now let's say she then gets married to a Levi, so tochal b'maiser. Now she's allowed to eat maiser, because she's married to the Levi. Mace, if he dies, V'lo menu ben, and she has a son from him, tochal b'maiser, she can eat maiser, because she has a son from the Levi. Nisas leKohen, now if she then gets married to a Kohen, tochal b'truma, now she can eat truma, she's married to the Kohen. Mace, if he dies, V'lo menu ben, and then she has a child from him, again, tochal b'truma, she can eat truma on account of her son, who is the son of the Kohen. Mace benami Kohen, if her son from the Kohen dies, so lo tochal b'truma, now she can't have truma, because again, she's not married to a Kohen, and she doesn't have a child from the Kohen. Mace benami Levi, if her son dies from the Levi, lo tochal b'maiser, she can't eat from the Maiser. Mace benami Yisrael, if her son dies from the Yisrael, so then choseres lebeis avia, she's allowed to go back to her father's house. Ve'alzu nemar, and this it says v'shavel beis avia kenureh, she goes back to her father's house like the times when she was a nara. Milechem avia tochel, she can eat from the bread of her father, meaning at this point in time she's going to be allowed to eat truma. And Rashi over here explains, Bas Kohen shenisas liYisrael lo tochal b'truma. If the Bas Kohen marries Yisrael, she can't have truma. The pasuk, she's disqualified because of the marriage to the Yisrael. Because the pasuk says, let's say her husband dies, she has no children, she returns to her father's house to have truma. That sounds like while her husband is alive, she cannot eat truma. Meis benami Kohen lo tochal b'truma. Then it said if her son from the Kohen dies, she can't eat truma. The pasuk lo Levi, because there's a disqualification again from the Levi, because she has a child from the Levi, so she can't have truma. And so the Gemara says, Meis benami Levi, if her son dies from the Levi, tochal b'truma. So then we said she's allowed to eat truma on account of the son that she had from the Kohen. So dahadra achla mishum b'na, the fact that she can go back and now eat truma again because of her son, menolan, from where do we learn such a halacha? Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav. Rabbi Abba says the name of Rav, bas ubas. It's because it says the word ubas, it's an extra vav, and therefore we darshan that extra vav to include even this case. Rashi says, "Dahadra achla mishum b'na, the katani masnisan gave bas Yisrael meis benami Levi tochal b'truma b'shvil b'na." We're talking about the bas Yisrael here. So if her son from the Levi died, she can eat truma because of the son that she has from the Kohen. Minolan dezarha ochelos b'shvil b'na. How do you know that if you have a woman who's not from a Kohen and she's eating because of her son, v'niz is lazar, and then she marries somebody who's a zar, v'meis and he dies, shechozeres v'ochelos, that she's allowed to go back and now continue eating because of that son. Gemara says bas ubas. It says ubas Kohen kitzial mono. That's the pasuk that talks about returning the beis avi, etc. So it uses the word ubas with an extra vav over there. So therefore, again, we darshan that extra vav. And the Gemara continues, Keman, so who does that follow? Is it Rabbi Akiva, the Dorish Vavi? Is it like Rabbi Akiva who darshans extra vavs? That's unique to Rabbi Akiva's Shita. Gemara says, Afilu Temer Rabbanan. No, you could even say it's the Rabbanan Kula Ubas Kro Yiseiruhu. The whole pasuk, the whole word Ubas, is actually an extra pasuk. Rashi says, Rabbi Akiva, the Dorish Vavi, Beperak Daled Misas, that's in Sanhedrin. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Yishmal Achi Bas Ubas Ani Dorish, so he darshans the vavs. Kule Kro Ubas Yiseiruhu. No, the whole word Ubas is extra. Dechsiv Le'el Minei Ubas Kohen Kisiel Yesh Zar, because it already says Ubas Kohen. Besamach Le Ubas Kohen Kisiel Almana. Now it says again Ubas Umatzi LeMechta V'Chisiel Almana Grusha. Could just say if she's going to be an Almana Grusha. V'Anoya Dana the Ubas Kohen Mishtay. I know that we're talking about Ubas Kohen. D'Haminei Salak. That's what we've been talking about all along, and therefore again the whole word Ubas is extra. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Keshi Choseres, when she returns to her father's house, let's say she's widowed, for example, from her husband who's a Yisrael, so Choseres l'truma veina Choseres l'chazav v'shok. So she's allowed to return in terms of eating truma. She's now allowed to eat truma, but she's not allowed to eat from the chazav v'shok. The chazav v'shok are the parts of karbanos, the breast and the hind leg that are separated and given to the Kohanim. In this particular case, when she's returning to her father's house, she's not entitled to the chazav v'shok. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ravina Bar Shila. Rav Chisda says in the name of Ravina Bar Shila, Mikra, what pasuk teaches us this, that she doesn't get the chazav v'shok? So he says, He b'trumas hakadashim lo tochel. She is in the truma of the kadshim, she's not allowed to eat. Now this pasuk, the simple translation of the pasuk, it's not talking about a case of a choseres, but Rashi will explain how we darshan that it is in fact referring to a choseres, and it's saying b'mura min hakadashim, that which is separated, lifted from the karbanos, lo tochel, she's not allowed to eat. It's referring again to the fact that a choseres, the woman who's going back to her father's house, she's a Bas Kohen, she's she's not allowed to have the chaz of Ashok. Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says in the name of Rabba bar Avua, milechem. It says when she goes back to her father's house, she gets from the lechem of her father, velo kol lechem, but she doesn't get all the bread of her father. Again, prat lechaz of Ashok. It comes to exclude the chaz of Ashok. Ma'askef lo Rami bar Chama. Rami bar Chama asks a question on this answer. Ema prat lahafaras nedarim. Maybe the exclusion should be that normally her father is allowed to annul her vows, but if she already got married and she's going back to her father's house, maybe that's what it means. He's excluded. He's no longer allowed to annul her vows. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Kvar Paska Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel. The relationship between her and her father in terms of Hafaras Nadarim has already been Paska, it's already been severed based on the teaching in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel, because it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, V'neider Almono Grusha Yakom Allah. The Pasuk is saying that the oath of an Almono Grusha, a widow or divorcee, that has to stand. There's no one that can really annul that vow. So the Gemara says, Ma Talmud Lomer, what is the pasuk here teaching us? V'halo motza michlal avu motza michlal bal. In such a case, she's already excluded. She's been taken out from her father's household, and she's out of her husband's household. We're talking about an almono grusha. Ela haresha masara av l'shluchei habal. What the pasuk means is, let's say the father gave her over to the messengers, the agents of the husband. O shemasar shluchei ha'av l'shluchei habal. Let's say the agents of the father gave her over to the agents of the husband. V'nisar malon eskarsh, and then at that point she becomes widowed or divorced by derech on the road. In other words, she was just in the process of really just getting married, and now suddenly she becomes widowed or divorced. How do I refer to this woman? Is she in the house of her father? Is she in the house of her husband? Rather, the pasuk is teaching you as follows. Once she leaves, even for one moment, from the reshus of her father, that's what the pasuk means. He's no longer able to annul her vows. That's exactly what the pasuk is teaching us. And so we already know that the father is excluded from Hafaras Nadarim the moment she gets married, and that happens forever. So again, therefore, the pasuk is teaching us prat l'chaz of Ashok, that when she returns to her father's house, she gets the truma, but not the chaz of Ashok. And the Gemara continues. Rav Safra Amar, Rav Safra says a different source. It says milechem avia tochel. It says she eats from the bread of her father. Lechem v'lo basar. It means bread literally and not meat. And the chaz of Ashok, that's meat, so she's not entitled to that if she's a choseres. Rav Papa Amar, Rav Papa says a different source. Milechem avia tochel. It says she eats from the lechem of her father. Lechem hakonoi lavia. That means it's the lechem that is acquired by her father. Prat lechaz of Ashok. That excludes chaz of Ashok. The mishulchan gavoa kazacho, because there the father is really eating from the shulchan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He doesn't really acquire the chaz of Ashok. And the Gemara continues. V'Rava Amar, and Rava says, V'es chazei hatnufa v'es shok hatruma tochlu ata uvanecha uvnosecha itach. It says that you, talking to the Kohanim, you and your sons and your daughters, you're going to get the chaz of Ashok. And it means to say, bizman she'itcha, that's only true when they are with you. And again, in this case, she's been married, she is not with you. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Ada bar Rava, Rav Ada bar Rava says, Tana was taught, Keshi choseres lebeis avia, when she returns to her father's house, choseres letruma ve'ena choseres lechaz of Ashok. She returns to eat truma, but she does not return to eat the chaz of Ashok like we said. But b'shvil b'na, but if she's eating on account of her son, let's say she had a son who was from a Kohen, so then choseres af lechaz of Ashok. Then she's even allowed to return even to the chaz of Ashok. In that case, she's entitled to the chaz of Ashok as well. And the Gemara continues, Azol Rav Mordechai Amr L'Shmaita Kami de Rav Ashi. Rav Mordechai went and he said over this teaching in front of Rav Ashi this idea that if she's choseres on account of her son, not choseres to her father's house, she is allowed to have the chaz of Ashok. So Amar, so he said, Mehecha kamis Rabia. Where did you learn this halacha out, that if it's on account of her child, she's allowed to have the truma? Me ubas. You learned it out from the pasuk of ubas. Mi adifa la mina. Is that make her better than the actual bas kohen? In other words, a bas Yisrael. So if she's with an ish zo, if a bas Yisrael rather marries a Kohen, and then she has a child with a Kohen, you learn out from Ubas that if she has any kid from the Kohen, she's allowed to have the Truma and the Chaz of Ashok, apparently. But is that better than an actual Bas Kohen? So she separates, or she's widowed, or she's divorced from her husband who's the Yisrael. Now she's actually worse off the Bas Kohen and doesn't get the Chaz of Ashok, she only gets Truma. And the Gemara answers, Hasam Ksivi Miyute. Over there, like we just said, there's exclusions, whatever pasuk it is, but there are psukim that say that she only gets Truma from the base of Via, but she doesn't get the Chaz chaz v'shok. But over here, when we're talking about the Bas Yisrael, who has a child from a Kohen, lo ksivim miyute, there are no exclusions, and therefore, since there are no exclusions, not only does she get truma on account of the child, she also gets chaz v'shok on account of the child. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here, b'mura min hakadoshim. So the first source was he betrumas hakadoshim lo tochel. She can't have trumas hakadoshim, and we understand that to mean she's not allowed to have the mura min hakadoshim. She can't have the chaz v'shok, says Rashi. Midahavamotzi l'michtav b'kadoshim. It could have just said she can't have kadoshim. V'chasa betrumas, and it uses the word betrumas hakadoshim. Lemurim hudas. It's coming to that which is separated from the carbon, meaning again the chaz v'shok. V'haylo socha liolam, and it means she can never have the chaz v'shok. And now Rashi explains v'lo tema b'yosheves tachas bali Yisrael. Now the actual pasuk is talking about a situation of a Bas Kohen who's married to a husband who's a Yisrael, and that's what it means. She can't have truma. That's the simple meaning of the pasuk. But don't say that's the meaning over here in terms of chaz v'shok. Kedemashma kra, like the pasuk implies, u'Bas Kohen kisi elir zar v'chulu. It says a Bas Kohen marries a zar. Do kimna lahai kra b'perak almonim, because earlier we say that this pasuk is actually talking about beniva lo lepasula. It's actually talking about a woman who was disqualified because she had relations with someone she was puzzled to. Could go nisin or mamzer v'chalo shapsulo lomis. That's like a nisin or mamzer chalo passes her forever. The kohenes the minsav l'zar de lo achla. Now by a kohenes, the fact that when she's married to a zar she doesn't eat mi v'shavel beisavia yalfin, and that's actually learned from the fact that the pasuk says that when she separates from the zar she returns to her father. Mechlal de meikar lo achla. That already tells us that while she's married to the zar she cannot eat. Umilze de Rav Chisda mi betrumas nafka. So therefore we see already this pasuk is not meant to be read in the traditional fashion that it seems to be read, that it's talking about a woman who's a Bas Kohen who marries a zar. Rather, again, it was talking about various disqualifications, and so therefore that's what Rav Chisda is saying over here. He's learning from Betrumas Dimkein Kula de Kulakra Lenivala Lepasalas. If the whole pasuk was talking about a woman who was disqualified because she had relations with someone she was puzzled to, so Lichto Bakadashim Lo Tochel could say she can't have Kadshim, she's disqualified. My Betrumas, what's Betrumas? And that's the drasha. Shema Mino Hachi Kamar. You see that the pasuk means as follows: Yesh lach acheres she'ocheles bekadshim kegon truma ve'ein ocheles b'muram. There is a woman who can eat truma, but she cannot eat muram. She cannot eat chaz v'shok. Ve'ezuzu choseres. And who is that? That's the choseres. Why do we know it's talking about choseres? The samechla, because that's the pasuk right next to it. It says a Bas Kohen kisi almana. A Bas Kohen, she becomes an almana. She's choseres lebeis avia v'achi toritzna laha milsa beperak almana. This is what we say in perak almana. We explain how this pasuk refers to this particular case. And then the Gemara said, Ve'ema prat lahafaras nadarim. Maybe the exclusion is she doesn't return to her father's house in terms of the annulment of the vows. Velo teima ki hechidlin shuma hadra lemilsa kamaisa ta'adunami linyan nadarim. Maybe you would say if she's returning for truma, she should return for nadar. Maybe that's the exclusion. And so then the Gemara said, no, because we have this ton of devei Rabbi Shmuel. Let's say you have a situation of an agent. She's on the way. She's on the road. She's going to her husband's house. She doesn't even get there, and then she's widowed or divorced. Motza mechlal av u'miyafer. This woman, she's not in the rishus of her father. He can annul. But in this case, where she's kind of on the road, so she hasn't left totally, maybe the husband could be mefer. Or maybe she's in the husband's house, and therefore maybe she's a widow really already from the husband, and the father cannot. That's what this pasuk is teaching. To say to you, once she leaves the house, the father of the house, even the house of the father, rather, even for a moment, so then we say again, we already understand that he cannot annul her vows. And Rashi over here also notes truma hi knuya lekohanim. Truma is something that's acquired by the kohanim. That's what we said in the Gemara. She'ina shirei shluchan melech. It's not like the leftovers from the table of the king of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval shirei kajim, but the leftovers of karbonas harin kamasas meis pnei elokim shein shiru shulchan. That's like the leftovers from God's table, so to speak. So that's why again, that's the difference between chaz and shok. Chaz and shok is not something that's really acquired by the kohen. It's mishulchan gavoa. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Bas Kohen shenisas li Yisrael v'chulu. Let's say you have a Bas Kohen who marries a Yisrael, so she's disqualified from truma. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabban, and the rabbis taught v'shavel beis avi. It says she returns to her father's house. Prat l'shomeres yavam. That excludes the shomeres yavam. In other words, let's say a woman, her husband dies. So again, it's talking about the same case, a Bas Kohen to a Yisrael. So if she's shomeres yavam, if she's still awaiting yivam, it's not considered like she returned to her father's house, and she would not get truma. And then it also says kinurel, like she was in her youth, prat l'muberes. That would exclude a woman who's pregnant. If the Bas Kohen is pregnant, again, she married a Yisrael and she's pregnant from the Yisrael, she's not going to be entitled to truma. She cannot return to her father's house. The Gemara says, why do you need this pasuk of kinureh? Valo dinu. Shouldn't it be able to be learned out from a kal v'chomer that a muberes cannot cannot have the truma. Uma b'mokum shelo asa vlad min harishon kevlad min hasheni. If you're talking about a situation, or if in a situation where the child from the first husband is not the same as the child from the second husband, lepotra min hayibum, to pater from yibum. In other words, let's say you had a woman who she married one husband, and she had a child from him, and then that husband died. Then she goes ahead, she marries another husband, and from that husband, the second husband, she has no child. So we say she's not pater from yibum. The child from the first husband is irrelevant. That's what we mean. Shelo asa vlad min harishon kevlad min hasheni. The child from the first husband is irrelevant, and we say she's still chayev in yibum. But asa ubor kiyalud. But in that case, we do say that if she's pregnant from the second husband, it's the same thing as if she had a child from the second husband, and the pregnancy paters her from yibum. So if we say that, so makom sha'asa vlad min harishon kevlad min hasheni. So what about in a situation of truma where we say it doesn't matter who she has a child with? The halach is that, let's say she has a child with husband number one or husband number two. It doesn't make a difference. If she had a child with her first husband who was Yisrael, and then that husband died, and then she remarried and she had no child from the second husband, the halacha is that it's the same thing. Lepos leminat truma. She is possible from truma based on the child already from the first marriage. So eino din shenasa uber kiyulot. So certainly we should say in such a situation that, let's say she just has a pregnancy, that should be counted as if she had a child. Pregnancy should certainly be enough to disqualify her from truma. Meaning to say, if pregnancy is enough to disqualify the yibum, so certainly when it comes to truma, the pregnancy should be enough. And the Gemara says, lo, no, you can't necessarily make that kal v'chomer. Why? Because mali asa uber kiyulud le'inyan yibum. When we say that pregnancy is the same as giving birth, that's by yibum. Sharei asa mesim kechayim. Because when it comes to yibum, it doesn't matter if the child is dead or if the child's alive. Once she has a child, let's say she has a child from the husband who died, and now the issue is, should she do yibum to the husband's brother? But if she had a child, even if that child has died, it's the same thing. Mesim is kechayim. She had a child from that first husband, there's no yibum. So does that necessarily mean nasa uber kiyulud le'inyan truma? Should we say that pregnancy is the same as giving birth by truma? Shelo asa mesim kechayim. Because there, as we've said over here, the dead is not the same as alive. Let's say that child dies, so she does return to her father's house to have truma. So therefore, also maybe if she's pregnant, it's not enough to exclude her from the truma, and that's why we need a pasuk. Talmud lomer kinurea prat l'muberes. That's why the pasuk says kinurea has to be like her youth. If she's pregnant, she's not like she was in her youth. And the Gemara says v'tzrich lemichtav muberes v'tzrich lemichtav v'zera ein la. You need to have a pasuk that indicates by a muberes that she doesn't get truma, and you also need to have a pasuk that says she doesn't have children, meaning to say if she has children, then she's also excluded from truma. Why do we need both? Because of rachmana v'zera ein la. If it only said v'zera ein la, so meikar echad gufa v'hashta tre gufe. Originally, when she came in, she was one body. Now she has a child. There are two people, two individuals over here. If the child is actually born, so then she doesn't return to her father's house. If she had a child from Yisrael, she doesn't get truma. Avo muberes, but if she's just pregnant, to make karachad gufa, originally she's one body. V'hashdachad gufa, now it's still one body. She's pregnant. The child is still within her. So emateichol, then I might say she is allowed to eat truma. She can go back to her father's house. So tzricha. So that's why the pasuk needs to say even if she's pregnant, she cannot have the truma because of rachmanu muberes. And let's say it only said muberes to make kara gufa, because over there her body was, and we're going to say there her body was empty, so to speak. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis.